I was 20 years old when I learned that love could destroy a woman as easily as it could save her. And I was 27 when I stood before the iron gates of Blackwood Manor once more, my heart pounding with the weight of everything I had buried and everything I could no longer hide. The letter had arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse bore the unmistakable crest of the Blackwood family. I remember the way my hands trembled as I took the envelope from him, the way my daughter Lily looked up at me with her wide, curious eyes and asked why Mama had gone so pale. I told her it was nothing, just a letter from an old acquaintance, but even as the words left my lips, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. 7 years, 7 long years since I had last seen those gates, last walked those halls, last breathed the air that smelled of old wood and lavender and secrets too heavy to speak aloud. 7 years since I had been cast out in disgrace, my reputation shattered, my heart broken into pieces so small I thought I would never find them all again. And now, with a few strokes of ink on parchment, I was being summoned back to the place that had both given me everything and taken it all away. I read the letter 3 times before I could make sense of the words. The Duchess was dead. An accident, they said, a fall from her horse on a misty autumn morning. And in the aftermath of her passing, a child had been discovered among her belongings. A baby, wrapped in a blanket embroidered with the Blackwood crest, with no explanation of its origin. The letter was formal, almost cold in its precision, but I could read between the lines well enough. They thought the child was mine. They thought I had somehow, impossibly, left a baby at the doorstep of the family that had destroyed me. The accusation was absurd, of course. I had not set foot near Blackwood Manor since the night I was thrown out, my belongings stuffed into a single trunk, my eyes blinded by tears I refused to let fall until I was safely hidden in the darkness of the hired carriage. But I knew, even as I crumpled the letter in my fist, that I would have to go back. Not to defend myself against their ridiculous suspicions, but because there was a truth buried in that house that I had carried alone for far too long. Lily was 6 years old, with hair the color of chestnuts and eyes that held the same gray-green depths as the man who had fathered her. She did not know who her father was. I had told her only that he was a good man, a noble man, who had loved us both but could not be with us. It was a lie wrapped around a truth, the way so many things in my life had become. And now, as I packed our modest belongings and prepared to face the ghosts of my past, I wondered if the time had finally come to unwrap it all. The journey from our village to Blackwood Manor took 2 days by coach. I watched the landscape change through the window, the rolling hills giving way to dense forests and then to the manicured estates of the aristocracy. Lily chattered happily for the first few hours, excited by the adventure of travel. But as we drew closer to our destination, even she seemed to sense the change in me. She grew quiet, pressing her small body against my side, her hand finding mine and holding on tight. I thought about him, of course. I thought about Edward Blackwood, the Duke, the man who had looked at me across a crowded ballroom and seen not a servant, but a woman. The man who had come to my room on a night when the rain battered the windows and the loneliness had become too much for either of us to bear. The man who had kissed me with a tenderness I had never known, who had whispered my name like a prayer, who had held me in his arms until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains and reminded us both of what we could never be. I had loved him. God help me. I had loved him with every fiber of my being, even knowing that our love was impossible, even knowing that he belonged to another woman, even knowing that the world would never forgive us if they discovered the truth. And when I learned I was carrying his child, I had done the only thing I could do. I had kept my silence, accepted the blame for a sin I had not committed with his son, and walked away from the only home I had ever known. The coach rattled to a stop before the gates, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Blackwood Manor rose before us like a specter from my dreams, its gray stone walls and towering chimneys unchanged by the passage of time. The gardens were still immaculate, the hedges trimmed into perfect shapes, the gravel drive raked smooth as glass. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, a monument to wealth and power and the secrets that lurked beneath every polished surface. A footman approached the coach to help us down, and I saw his eyes widen with recognition. He remembered me, this young man who had been barely more than a boy when I left. I could see the questions forming on his lips, the curiosity and the judgment, and the barely concealed shock. But he said nothing, only offered his hand and led us through the great front doors into the entrance hall. The smell hit me first. That particular combination of beeswax and old books and the faint, lingering trace of the Duchess's perfume that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself against the onslaught of memories. Lily pressed closer to me, her eyes wide as she took in the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers and the portraits of stern-faced ancestors that lined the walls. We were shown to a sitting room to wait, and I tried to compose myself as the minutes ticked by. I smoothed my dress, a simple gray wool that was the finest thing I owned, and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. I was no longer the young governess who had first entered this house with stars in her eyes and dreams of a better life. I was a woman now, hardened by years of struggle and sacrifice, strengthened by the love I bore for my daughter. I would not be intimidated. I would not be made to feel small. The door opened, and he was there. Edward Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, stood in the doorway like a man who had seen a ghost. He was older now, of course, the years etched into the lines around his eyes and the silver that touched his dark hair at the temples. But he was still the same man, still possessed of that commanding presence that had made my heart race from the very first moment I saw him. His eyes found mine across the room, and I felt the world fall away, felt time itself hold its breath. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and in that silence stretched all the words we had never spoken, all the truths we had never acknowledged, all the pain we had caused each other and ourselves. And then Lily stepped forward, curious and unafraid, and said in her clear, bright voice, "Papa, is this your house?" She did not know, of course. She could not know. She had simply seen a man who looked like the father in her imagination, the noble figure I had described in my carefully crafted stories. But the word hung in the air between us, charged with a meaning that made Edward's face go pale and my heart stop beating in my chest. He recovered quickly, his expression smoothing into the mask of aristocratic composure I remembered so well. He knelt down to Lily's level, his movements slow and careful, as if approaching a wild creature he did not wish to frighten. "And who might you be, little one?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion I could not quite identify. "I am Lily Ashford," she replied, offering him a curtsy that I had taught her, "and this is my mother, Clara. She is the best seamstress in all of England, and she makes the prettiest dresses you have ever seen." Edward's eyes lifted to mine, and I saw the question there, the dawning realization that he was trying desperately to suppress. He rose to his feet, his gaze never leaving my face, and I felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing pressing against my skin. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "thank you for coming. I apologize for the abruptness of the summons, but the circumstances are rather urgent." I inclined my head, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Your Grace." The formality felt wrong, a barrier erected between two people who had once known each other in the most intimate way possible. But it was necessary, I reminded myself. It was the only protection either of us had. Edward gestured toward the door, his expression unreadable. "If you would follow me, there is something I must show you. The child may remain here. The nursemaid will look after her." I hesitated, reluctant to let Lily out of my sight in this place that held so many painful memories. But she was already being charmed by a kindly-looking woman who had appeared as if by magic, her attention captured by the promise of biscuits and a tour of the nursery. I pressed a kiss to her forehead and told her to be good, and then I followed Edward out of the room and into the shadowed corridors of my past. We walked in silence, our footsteps echoing on the polished floors. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, unwilling to look at the rooms we passed, the memories they contained. The library where I had first spoken to him, discussing books and philosophy like equals. The music room where I had heard him play the piano one evening, unaware that he had an audience. The melody so beautiful it had brought tears to my eyes. The conservatory where he had found me crying after his mother had been particularly cruel and had offered me his handkerchief without a word. We climbed the stairs to the family wing, and I felt my heart begin to pound with increasing urgency. This was the part of the house I had rarely entered as a governess, the private domain of the Duke and Duchess and their closest family. The carpet here was thick and soft beneath my feet, muffling our steps, and the portraits on the walls showed generations of Blackwoods looking down with expressions of aristocratic disdain. Edward stopped before a door I did not recognize and turned to face me. His expression was troubled, his jaw tight with tension. "Before I show you what lies within this room," he said quietly, "I must ask you a question. And I need you to answer me honestly, Clara. Not as a servant to a master, but as one human being to another." I met his gaze, refusing to look away. "Ask your question, Your Grace." He was silent for a long moment, as if gathering the courage to speak. "The child they found among my wife's belongings. Is it yours?" The question struck me like a blow, even though I had known it was coming. I felt the familiar surge of anger and hurt that had sustained me through the darkest years of my exile, the indignation of being accused of something I had not done. But I also saw something in Edward's eyes that gave me pause. He was not accusing me. He was pleading with me, desperate for an answer that would make sense of the chaos that had descended upon his life. "No," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "It is not my child. I have only one child, and you have already met her." Something flickered in his expression, a mixture of relief and a deeper, more complex emotion that I could not quite name. He nodded slowly, as if my answer had confirmed something he already suspected. "Then I think you need to see this," he said, and opened the door. The room beyond was a nursery, cheerful and bright, with pale blue walls and white lace curtains that fluttered in the breeze from an open window. A cradle stood in the center of the room, carved from dark wood and draped with fine linens, and in that cradle lay a baby, a tiny, perfect infant with a tuft of reddish hair and a face flushed pink with sleep. I approached the cradle slowly, my heart twisting with an emotion I could not quite identify. The baby was beautiful, perhaps 3 or 4 months old, wrapped in a blanket of the finest wool. And embroidered on that blanket, in thread of gold and silver, was the Blackwood family crest. I reached out to touch the blanket, to feel the quality of the embroidery beneath my fingers, and as I did, I noticed something else. A small birthmark on the baby's wrist, a crescent-shaped shadow that seemed somehow familiar. I had seen that mark before, I realized. Not on Edward, and not on anyone in the main Blackwood line, but on someone else. Someone who had always lurked at the edges of this family, watching and waiting and wanting what he could never have. I looked up at Edward, and I saw that he had come to the same realization. His face was ashen, his hands clenched at his sides, and in his eyes I saw the terrible weight of a truth he did not want to accept. "This is not my child," I whispered, the words falling from my lips before I could stop them. "But I think I know whose it is." Edward closed his eyes, and for a moment I saw past the mask of the Duke to the man beneath. The man who had loved his wife despite everything, who had tried to make a marriage of convenience into something more, who had failed and blamed himself for that failure. The man who had once held me in his arms and confessed that I was the only person who had ever truly seen him. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what you know." And so I did. I told him about the whispers I had heard as a governess, the rumors that swirled through the servants' quarters about the Duchess and her frequent absences. I told him about the night I had seen her slipping out of the house, wrapped in a cloak of midnight blue, hurrying toward the stables where a carriage waited in the shadows. I told him about the letters I had accidentally discovered, hidden in a secret compartment of her writing desk, letters filled with passionate declarations and desperate promises, letters signed with a single initial. The letter W. Edward listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each word I spoke. When I finished, he turned away from me, walking to the window and staring out at the gardens below. His shoulders were rigid with tension, his hands gripping the windowsill so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "William," he said at last, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "My brother." I said nothing, for there was nothing to say. The truth was too terrible for words, too painful to acknowledge aloud. The Duchess had been having an affair with Edward's younger brother, and this child, this innocent baby sleeping peacefully in its cradle, was the product of that betrayal. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of shared grief and shared anger. I wanted to go to him, to offer some comfort, but I knew that I could not. Too much stood between us, too many years and too many lies and too much pain that could never be undone. Finally, Edward turned back to face me. His eyes were dry, but there was a haunted quality to them that spoke of wounds too deep to heal. "I need to know everything," he said. "Everything you saw, everything you heard, everything you even suspected. I need to understand how this happened, and I need to know what to do now." I nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. This was not just about the baby or the scandal that would ensue if the truth became known. This was about justice, about honor, about the very foundation of the family that Edward had dedicated his life to protecting. And so I began to tell him the rest. The secrets I had kept for 7 years, the truths I had buried along with my broken heart. And as I spoke, I watched the last vestiges of the man I had loved disappear behind the cold mask of the Duke, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The reckoning had begun. But even as I spoke, even as the terrible truth unfolded between us, a part of my mind kept returning to the sitting room downstairs. To Lily, my beautiful daughter with her chestnut hair and her gray-green eyes, the eyes of her father, the eyes of the Duke of Ashworth. Edward did not know yet. He had not made the connection, had not realized that the child I had raised alone for 6 years was his own flesh and blood. But he would. Sooner or later, he would look at Lily and see himself reflected back, and then the questions would begin. I was not ready for those questions. I was not ready to explain why I had kept silent, why I had let him believe the lie that had destroyed my reputation. I was not ready to tell him that I had loved him so fiercely, so completely, that I would have endured any humiliation rather than see him suffer. But ready or not, the moment was coming. And as the afternoon light began to fade and the shadows lengthened across the nursery floor, I knew that my life was about to change forever. Again. The clock in the hallway struck 4, and Edward straightened, pulling himself together with visible effort. "There will be time to discuss this further," he said, his voice once again controlled and distant. "For now, I must attend to certain matters. You and your daughter will be given rooms in the guest wing. I trust you will find them comfortable." It was a dismissal, polite but unmistakable. I curtsied, the old habits of servitude reasserting themselves despite everything. "Thank you, Your Grace." I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me at the door. "Clara." I looked back, my heart catching at the sound of my name on his lips. Yes. He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. "Thank you," he said finally, "for coming, for telling me the truth." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and slipped out of the room. The corridor was empty, the only sound the distant ticking of clocks and the whisper of the wind against the windows. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes, trying to slow the frantic beating of my heart. I had survived the first encounter. I had faced him again after all these years and had not crumbled, but the hardest part was yet to come. In a few moments, I would return to my daughter. I would take her to our rooms and help her settle in for the night. I would answer her questions about this grand house and the serious man with the kind eyes and try to keep my voice steady as I wove more careful half-truths around the bones of our story. And tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps a week from now, the Duke of Ashworth would look at Lily and see the truth written in her features. He would understand at last who she really was, and then everything would change. I pushed myself away from the wall and began the long walk back to the sitting room. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, a lonely sound that seemed to capture everything I felt in that moment. The weight of the past, the uncertainty of the future, the strange, impossible hope that had begun to kindle somewhere deep in my chest. Perhaps this time, I thought, perhaps this time, things would be different. But even as the hope flickered to life, I remembered all the reasons it should not, the scandal that still clung to my name, the society that would never accept me, the family that had cast me out, and the brother who had let me take the blame for sins I had not committed. The brother, William. I had not thought about him in years, had deliberately pushed all memory of him from my mind. But now, with the discovery of the baby and the letters and the terrible truth they revealed, I knew that I would have to face him again. And the thought filled me with a dread that went far deeper than any scandal could explain. Because William Blackwood had been the one to accuse me. William had been the one to find me in the corridor outside Edward's study on that fateful morning, my dress still rumpled from the night before, my hair still loose around my shoulders. William had looked at me with those pale, knowing eyes and had smiled a smile that made my blood run cold. And then he had gone to the Dowager Duchess and told her that he had seen me emerging from young Lord Thomas's bedchamber, that he had witnessed me, the governess, seducing the heir to the Blackwood fortune, that I was nothing but a scheming fortune hunter who needed to be cast out before I could do any more damage. It had been a lie, every word of it. I had never so much as touched Thomas Blackwood, had never had any interest in the spoiled, petulant young man who treated servants as if they were furniture. But William's word had been believed because William was family and I was nothing. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late. I had been given 1 hour to pack my belongings, 1 hour to say goodbye to the children I had been teaching, to the other servants who had become my friends, to the life I had built for myself in this house. And through it all, I had kept my silence about the truth, about Edward, about the night we had spent together and the love we had shared and the child that was already growing inside me. I had protected him, even as I was being destroyed, and he had never known. But now, standing in the corridor of Blackwood Manor with the past pressing in on all sides, I began to wonder if my silence had been a mistake. I had thought I was saving Edward from scandal, from the ruin of his reputation and his marriage. But what had I really done? I had allowed a lie to stand unchallenged. I had let William Blackwood escape the consequences of his treachery. And I had condemned myself to 7 years of struggle and hardship that I should never have had to endure. Perhaps it was time for the truth to come out, all of it. Every secret, every lie, every carefully constructed deception that had kept this family together while it rotted from within. Perhaps it was time for the reckoning to begin. I found Lily in the nursery where she had been taken, playing happily with a set of wooden blocks while the nursemaid watched with a gentle smile. She looked up as I entered, her face lighting with joy, and ran to throw her arms around my waist. "Mama," she exclaimed, "this house is so big. There are 1,000 rooms, I'm sure of it. And the lady says there is a pond with ducks, and a garden with a maze, and a library with more books than anyone could ever read." I smiled despite myself, running my fingers through her soft hair. "It sounds wonderful, darling. Did you have a good time?" "Oh, yes," she said earnestly. "But I missed you. Are we going to stay here long?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "For a little while," I said finally. "The Duke has asked for my help with something, and I could not refuse." Lily nodded, accepting this explanation with the easy trust of childhood. "He seems nice," she said thoughtfully. "The Duke, I mean. He has sad eyes, though, like he lost something important and cannot find it again." Out of the mouths of babes, I thought, my heart clenching. Yes, I agreed quietly. I think he has lost many things. We followed a footman to the guest wing, where we were shown to a suite of rooms far grander than anything I had ever occupied. There was a sitting room with velvet chairs and a marble fireplace, a bedroom with a canopied bed draped in silk, and a smaller chamber for Lily with a window that looked out over the gardens. It was beautiful, comfortable, and utterly alien. Lily explored every corner with delight, bouncing on the bed and exclaiming over the softness of the pillows. But I stood at the window of the sitting room, looking out at the grounds as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in this house, a baby slept in its cradle, the product of betrayal and deceit. Somewhere in this house, a duke grappled with the destruction of everything he had believed about his marriage. And somewhere out in the world, a brother plotted and schemed, unaware that his secrets were about to be exposed. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window, feeling the weight of all that was to come. Tomorrow would bring questions and confrontations and truths that could not be unsaid. Tomorrow would change everything, for better or for worse. But tonight, I had my daughter safe beside me and a fire burning in the hearth. Tonight, I would rest and gather my strength for the battles ahead. And tomorrow, I would begin to fight for the justice I had been denied 7 years ago, not just for myself, but for Lily, for Edward, for the truth that had been buried for far too long. The reckoning had begun, and I would see it through to the end, no matter what the cost. I did not sleep well that first night at Blackwood Manor. The bed was soft, the linens fine, and Lily slumbered peacefully in the adjoining room. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Edward's face. The shock when Lily had called him Papa, the pain when I told him about his wife's betrayal, the terrible, haunted look in his eyes as he stood by that window, realizing that everything he thought he knew about his marriage had been a lie. I rose before dawn and dressed quietly, not wanting to wake my daughter. The house was silent around me, that peculiar stillness that settles over grand estates in the hours before the servants begin their work. I slipped out of my room and made my way through the corridors, drawn by some instinct I could not name, toward the east wing of the house. This had been my domain once, when I was governess to the Blackwood children. The schoolroom was here, and the nursery, and the small chamber where I had slept and dreamed and fallen hopelessly in love with a man I could never have. I had not thought to return to these rooms, but my feet carried me there as if of their own accord, and before I knew it, I was standing before the door of what had once been my sanctuary. The room was empty now, stripped of the modest furnishings I remembered. The narrow bed was gone, and the small writing desk where I had composed my letters home, and the chair by the window where I had sat on countless evenings, watching the sun set over the gardens. It was just a room now, 4 walls and a floor and a ceiling, with no trace of the woman who had lived here and loved here and had her heart broken within these walls. I walked to the window and looked out at the gardens below. They were beautiful, even in the gray light of early morning. The hedges neatly trimmed, and the flower beds bare but carefully tended. I had spent many hours in those gardens, walking with the children or sitting alone with a book, trying to find some peace amid the turmoil of my secret feelings. It seemed a lifetime ago now, another world entirely, and yet standing here, I could almost believe that no time had passed at all. A sound behind me made me turn. Edward stood in the doorway, dressed for riding, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He looked as though he had slept no better than I had, shadows beneath his eyes and a tension in his jaw that spoke of troubled thoughts. "I could not sleep," I said, by way of explanation. "I hope you do not mind my wandering." He shook his head slowly, stepping into the room. "This was your chamber," he said, "when you were governess here." It was not a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, I was remembering. Edward walked to the window and stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint scent of horses and leather that clung to his clothes. He looked out at the gardens, and something in his expression softened. "I used to watch you," he said quietly, "from the library window. You would walk with the children in the afternoons. and I would find excuses to be near the window, just to see you smile. My heart stuttered in my chest. I did not know what to say, how to respond to this admission after so many years of silence. I had thought he had forgotten me, or at least convinced himself to forget. I had never imagined that he might have carried his own memories, his own regrets, all this time. Edward turned to face me, and in the growing light, I could see the conflict in his eyes. "Clara," he began, and then stopped, as if the words had become tangled on his tongue. "There is so much I need to say to you, so much I should have said years ago." I waited, barely breathing, afraid that any movement might break the spell of this moment. "I never believed it," he said at last, "what they said about you and Thomas. I knew it was a lie from the moment I heard it. My son was many things, but he was not capable of inspiring the kind of devotion they accused you of feeling. And you—" He paused, his gaze searching my face. "You were never the kind of woman to throw yourself at a foolish boy when you could have." He trailed off, but the unspoken words hung between us. "When you could have had me." "Then why?" I whispered, my voice rough with old pain. "Why did you let them send me away?" Edward closed his eyes, and I saw the guilt that he had carried for 7 years written plainly on his features. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I was afraid of what would happen if I defended you, if I told the truth about that night. My mother was already suspicious, already watching me, and Catherine." He took a breath, steadying himself. "My wife was pregnant, or so I believed at the time. I thought that if I caused a scandal, if I destroyed my marriage, I would be destroying the life of an innocent child as well." I stared at him, struggling to process what he was telling me. Catherine had claimed to be pregnant, but when I left, there had been no child, no announcement. The Duchess had remained childless for all the years of their marriage, until this mysterious baby that had appeared after her death. "She lost it," Edward said, reading the question in my eyes. "Or so she told me." "A miscarriage," she said, "brought on by the stress of the scandal." I blamed myself. I thought that my feelings for you had cost me my child. "And so you let me go," I said, understanding at last. "You sacrificed me to save a pregnancy that may never have existed." The words came out harsher than I intended, and I saw Edward flinch as if I had struck him. But I could not take them back, could not pretend that the pain of those years had not left its mark. I had suffered for his cowardice, had struggled and scraped and nearly starved while he lived in comfort and convinced himself that he had made the right choice. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I know what I did, and I know that no apology could ever be enough. But I need you to understand, Clara. I need you to know that not a day has passed when I did not think of you, when I did not wonder where you were and if you were safe, and if you had found some measure of happiness despite everything I had done." I turned away from him, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. The morning light was growing stronger now, spilling through the window and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. It was going to be a beautiful day, I thought absently. A beautiful day in this beautiful house that had been the site of so much ugliness. "There is something you need to know," I said, the words coming before I could stop them. "About Lily." I heard Edward go still behind me, his breath catching. I felt the weight of 7 years of secrets pressing down on my shoulders, demanding to be released. This was the moment I had dreaded, the moment I had known was coming from the instant I received that letter. And now that it was here, I found that I could not hold back any longer. "She is yours," I said, and turned to face him. "The child I was carrying when I left this house, the daughter I have raised alone for 6 years. She is your daughter, Edward, your flesh and blood." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. I watched the emotions play across Edward's face. Shock, disbelief, a dawning wonder that made him look younger than I had seen him since my return. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, and finally simply stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Mine," he whispered. "She is mine." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Edward took a step toward me, then stopped, as if afraid of what might happen if he came any closer. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a bewildered hurt that cut me to the quick. "Why did you let me believe?" "Because I loved you," I said, the truth spilling out at last. "Because I knew that if you acknowledged her, it would destroy everything. Your marriage, your family, your place in society. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was giving you the chance to live the life you were meant to live, without the burden of a scandal that would follow you forever." Edward made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "The life I was meant to live," he repeated bitterly. "Do you know what my life has been, Clara? Do you have any idea what these 7 years have cost me?" I shook my head, afraid to hear the answer but unable to turn away. "I married a woman who never loved me," he said, his voice growing harder with each word. "I watched her grow cold and distant, watched her turn away from me night after night, and I told myself it was my fault. I told myself that I had driven her away with my guilt, my inability to forget the woman I had wronged. And all the while, she was carrying on an affair with my own brother, laughing at me behind my back, making a fool of me in my own house. "Edward," I began, but he cut me off with a gesture. "I have a daughter," he said, and now there was wonder in his voice again, breaking through the bitterness. "I have a daughter, and I have missed 6 years of her life, her first words, her first steps, her first everything, and you kept that from me." I did not know what to say. Every justification I had built up over the years seemed hollow now, faced with the raw pain in his eyes. I had thought I was being noble, being selfless, but the truth was simpler and more shameful than that. I had been afraid of rejection, afraid of scandal, afraid of the chaos that would ensue if I dared to claim what was mine. "I am sorry," I said at last, the words inadequate, but the only ones I had. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought. "You thought I would not want her," Edward finished, his voice gentle now, the anger draining away to leave something softer in its wake. "You thought I would deny her, reject her, pretend she did not exist." The possibility had crossed my mind, I admitted. Edward shook his head slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I would have claimed her," he said. "I would have claimed you both. Society be damned. I would have found a way, Clara. If only you had trusted me enough to try." The words hung between us, heavy with all the might-have-beens of 7 wasted years. I felt tears prick at my eyes, the first I had allowed myself since leaving this house so long ago. I had built walls around my heart, convinced myself that I was strong, that I did not need anyone, that Lily and I could make our own way in the world. But standing here, in this empty room where I had once dreamed impossible dreams, those walls began to crumble. "I want to know her," Edward said, stepping closer. "I want to be her father, in truth, and not just in blood. I want to make up for all the time we have lost." "And what of the world?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What of society and scandal and all the reasons we could never be together?" Edward reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm and strong around mine. "I am done living for the world," he said. "I am done sacrificing what matters for the sake of appearances. Let them talk, let them judge. I will not lose you again." I wanted to believe him. God help me. I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. But even as hope kindled in my chest, doubt whispered in my ear. We were not the only players in this drama. There was still the baby in the nursery, the question of its future. There was still William, lurking somewhere in the shadows, his secrets about to be exposed. And there was still the Dowager Duchess, Edward's mother, who had orchestrated my downfall and would surely not stand idly by while her son threw away his reputation for a former servant. As if summoned by my thoughts, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Edward released my hand and stepped back, his expression shifting into the mask of the Duke as the door swung open to reveal a face I had hoped never to see again. William Blackwood stood in the doorway, his pale eyes moving from Edward to me with an expression of barely concealed surprise. He was older now, his once handsome features grown sharp and calculating, his smile a thin line that held no warmth. He wore traveling clothes, dusty from the road, and there was a tension in his bearing that suggested he had come in haste. "Brother," he said, inclining his head toward Edward, "I came as soon as I received word about Catherine." He paused, his gaze settling on me with unmistakable recognition. "Miss Ashford, how unexpected to see you here." I met his gaze without flinching, though my heart was pounding. The last time I had seen William Blackwood, he had been watching me leave through these very gates, a satisfied smirk on his face. He had destroyed my life with a few carefully chosen lies, and he had never suffered a single consequence for it. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice cool and controlled. "It has been a long time. Indeed it has." He stepped into the room, his movements casual, but his eyes watchful. "I was sorry to hear of your difficulties after leaving our household. I trust you have managed to land on your feet." The false sympathy in his voice made my skin crawl. He knew exactly what difficulties I had faced, because he had been the architect of every one of them. But I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. "I have managed well enough," I replied. "Thank you for your concern." William's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. He turned to Edward, his manner shifting to something more deferential. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," he said smoothly. "I was in the country when I received the news, and I thought it best to come directly rather than send word ahead. How are you bearing up, Edward?" There was something wrong in his tone, a false note that set my nerves on edge. He was too calm, too composed for a man who had just learned of his sister-in-law's death, and there was something in the way he held himself, a coiled tension that suggested he was waiting for something, bracing himself for a blow that had not yet fallen. Edward's expression gave nothing away. "I am managing," he said coolly. "There are many matters to attend to, the funeral arrangements, the estate, and of course the question of the child." I saw William's composure flicker, just for an instant, before he recovered himself. "The child," he repeated carefully. "Yes, I had heard something about that. A foundling, they say, discovered among Catherine's things." "Not a foundling," Edward said, and his voice had gone hard and cold. "A baby with the Blackwood crest embroidered on its blanket. A baby that someone went to great lengths to connect with this family." The silence that followed was electric. William's face had gone pale, his easy smile frozen in place, and I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was trying to determine how much Edward knew, how much I had told him, how much danger he was in. "I am sure there is a reasonable explanation," William said at last. But his voice had lost its smoothness. "Perhaps some servant with delusions of grandeur, or a desperate woman hoping to claim a connection to a noble house." "Perhaps," Edward agreed, but his tone suggested he believed no such thing. "Or perhaps the explanation is simpler than that. Perhaps the child belongs to someone in this family after all." William laughed, but it was a brittle sound, unconvincing even to my ears. "Surely you do not mean to suggest that the child is yours," he said. "Catherine made it quite clear that you and she had not shared a bed in years." "No," Edward said softly, "I do not mean to suggest the child is mine." The implication hung in the air, impossible to ignore. I watched William's face as understanding dawned, watched the color drain from his cheeks and then flood back in an angry tide. For a long moment, no one spoke, and the tension in the room built until I thought it might shatter the windows. Then William laughed again, a harsh sound that held no humor. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice shook. "You cannot possibly believe such a ridiculous accusation." "I am your brother, Edward. Your blood." "Blood does not guarantee loyalty," Edward replied. "I have learned that lesson well." He moved toward the door, pausing beside William but not looking at him. "We will discuss this further," he said quietly, "but not here, and not now." I suggest you take some time to consider your position, brother, and to think very carefully about what you will say when I ask you directly whether that child is yours." William said nothing as Edward left the room. He stood frozen in place, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. And then, slowly, he turned to look at me. "You," he said, and there was venom in his voice. "This is your doing." I met his gaze without flinching. "I have done nothing but tell the truth." "The truth." He spat the word like a curse. "You know nothing of the truth. You are nothing but a servant, a nobody, a woman who spread her legs for my brother, and then had the audacity to act surprised when you were thrown out on the street." The crudeness of his words should have shocked me, but I felt only a cold, steady anger. I had spent 7 years rebuilding my life, 7 years learning to survive in a world that had turned against me. I would not be intimidated by this man, no matter what power he thought he held. "I know that you lied about me," I said, my voice steady. "I know that you accused me of a sin I did not commit, and that you did it to protect yourself. What I do not yet know is why, but I intend to find out." William's eyes narrowed. "You think you can threaten me?" he said softly. "You think that because Edward has taken you back into his bed, you have some kind of power here. But you are wrong. I have survived far worse than the accusations of a disgraced governess, and I will survive this as well." He stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the sweat and dust of his journey, close enough that I could see the fear lurking beneath his bravado. "Stay out of my way," he hissed, "and keep your mouth shut, or I will make sure that you regret ever setting foot in this house again." I did not step back, did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. "I have already lost everything once," I said quietly. "I have nothing left to fear from you." For a long moment we stared at each other, two adversaries measuring the other's strength. And then William turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving me alone with the dust and the memories and the growing certainty that the battle had only just begun. I found Lily awake and waiting for me when I returned to our rooms. She was sitting up in bed, her hair tousled from sleep, her gray-green eyes bright with curiosity. "Mama," she said as I entered, "I dreamed about the man with the sad eyes. The Duke. He was showing me a garden with a fountain, and there were birds singing, and he said it was all for me." I sat down on the edge of her bed and gathered her into my arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "It was just a dream, my darling," I said, but even as the words left my lips, I wondered if perhaps it had been something more. Children were sensitive to things that adults had learned to ignore, connections that defied logic and explanation. Lily pulled back to look at me, her expression serious beyond her years. "He is important, is he not, Mama?" she said. "The Duke. He is not just another man." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. The truth was too complicated for a child to understand, too fraught with scandal and heartbreak and the tangled history of adults who had made too many mistakes. But Lily deserved something, some acknowledgement of the bond she had sensed without fully understanding. "He is very important," I said at last, "and he wants to get to know you better, if you would like that." Lily considered this for a moment, her small face thoughtful. "I think I would like that," she said finally. "He seems kind, even though he is sad, and I think perhaps we could make him less sad if we tried." I hugged her tightly, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. Out of the mouths of babes, I thought again. Out of the mouths of babes. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. I helped Lily dress and took her down to the breakfast room, where we ate in the company of the housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had been new to the household when I left and therefore held no particular animosity toward me. She was polite but distant, as befitted her station, and she answered Lily's endless questions about the house with a patience that surprised me. Edward did not appear at breakfast, and neither did William. I learned from Mrs. Patterson that the Duke had closeted himself in his study with his solicitor and was not to be disturbed. "William," she added with a slight tightening of her lips, had taken himself off to the village on some errand and was not expected back until evening. After breakfast, I took Lily out to explore the gardens. The day had dawned clear and bright, the autumn sun warm on our faces, and Lily ran ahead of me down the gravel paths, exclaiming over every flower and fountain she discovered. I followed more slowly, lost in thought, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since my arrival. Edward knew the truth now, about Lily, and about the baby in the nursery. He had confronted William, had made it clear that he suspected his brother of the worst kind of betrayal. And William had threatened me, had made it plain that he would not go down without a fight. The pieces were all in motion, but I could not yet see how they would fall. I was so lost in my thoughts that I did not notice the other woman until she was almost upon me. She emerged from behind a hedge, dressed in black silk that rustled with each step, her silver hair swept up in an elaborate arrangement that spoke of hours spent before a mirror. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, Edward's mother, looked at me with the same cold disdain I remembered from 7 years ago. "Miss Ashford," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, "I had hoped the rumors of your return were exaggerated. It seems I was mistaken." I curtsied, the old habits of deference rising up despite my determination to be strong. "Your Grace, I hope I find you well." The Dowager's lips thinned. "You find me in mourning," she replied. "My daughter-in-law is barely cold in her grave, and already this house is overrun with ghosts from the past." She looked past me to where Lily had stopped to examine a rosebush, her small fingers reaching out to touch the last blooms of the season. "And I see you have brought another complication with you." The dismissive way she spoke of my daughter made my blood run hot. "Lily is my child," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "She is no complication, is she not?" The Dowager's gaze returned to me, and there was something knowing in her eyes that made my stomach clench. I wonder if my son would agree with that assessment. She knew. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The Dowager knew, or at least suspected, the truth about Lily's parentage. And if she knew, then she would stop at nothing to protect her family's reputation, even if it meant destroying me all over again. "Your Grace," I began, but she cut me off with a gesture. "Spare me your explanations," she said coldly. "I have no interest in your excuses or your justifications. I know what you are, Miss Ashford. A schemer, a seductress, a woman who uses her feminine wiles to entrap men above her station. You may have fooled my son once, but I will not allow you to do so again." I stared at her, speechless. The injustice of her accusations burned in my chest, but I knew that arguing with her would accomplish nothing. The Dowager had made up her mind about me years ago, and nothing I said would change it. "I did not come here to cause trouble," I said at last, forcing my voice to remain calm. "I came because your son summoned me, because he needed my help to unravel a mystery. If you have concerns about my presence, I suggest you take them up with him." The Dowager's expression flickered, a momentary uncertainty that she quickly masked. "My son," she said slowly, "is not thinking clearly. He is grieving, confused, vulnerable to manipulation. It falls to me to protect him from those who would take advantage of his weakness." "And who do you believe is taking advantage?" I asked, emboldened by her hesitation. "Me? Or perhaps someone closer to home?" For a long moment, the Dowager said nothing. Her eyes searched my face, looking for something I could not identify. And then, to my surprise, some of the coldness left her expression, replaced by something that looked almost like weariness. "You know about William," she said quietly. It was not a question. "I know enough." The Dowager closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, I saw a woman far older and more tired than the imperious figure she had presented. "Then you know that this family is on the brink of ruin," she said. "A scandal of this magnitude would destroy us. The Blackwood name would become a byword for treachery and shame." "Perhaps it should," I said, surprising myself with my own boldness. "Perhaps the truth is more important than appearances." The Dowager laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. You are young, she said. You still believe in things like truth and justice. But I have lived long enough to know that such ideals are luxuries, reserved for those who can afford them. The rest of us must make do with survival. She turned to go, but paused and looked back at me over her shoulder. Be careful, Miss Ashford, she said. My son may think he can protect you, but there are forces at work here that even he does not fully understand. And when the storm breaks, you may find yourself swept away with the rest of us. She walked away before I could respond, her black skirts trailing behind her like a shadow. I watched her go, my mind churning with questions and fears. What had she meant by forces at work? What did she know that she was not telling me? Mama, Lily called, running back to me with a handful of rose petals clutched in her fist. Look what I found. Are they not beautiful? I smiled down at her, pushing away my dark thoughts. They are lovely, my darling. Shall we press them in a book and keep them forever? Lily nodded eagerly, and I took her hand and led her back toward the house. The afternoon sun was warm on our backs, and the gardens were peaceful and serene. But beneath the beauty, I could feel the tension building, the gathering storm that the Dowager had warned me about. Something was coming, something that would test us all. And I could only pray that when it arrived, I would be strong enough to face it. The days that followed were strange and suspended, like the hush before a thunderstorm when the air grows thick and every living thing holds its breath. Edward kept to his study, meeting with solicitors and men of business, sending letters and receiving visitors I was not permitted to see. William moved through the house like a specter, appearing at meals with his thin smile fixed in place, watching everything and saying little. And the Dowager, true to her warning, observed it all from her throne in the morning room, her sharp eyes missing nothing. I spent my time with Lily, showing her the grounds I remembered from my years as governess, trying to give her some sense of normalcy in this grand and unsettling place. She was resilient, my daughter, adapting to her new surroundings with a flexibility that both amazed and humbled me. She made friends with the kitchen cat, a fat orange creature named Marmalade who followed her everywhere. She charmed the cook into giving her extra biscuits and won over the stable boys with her fearless delight in the horses. And slowly, tentatively, she began to ask about the Duke. He watches us sometimes, she told me one afternoon, as we walked along the lake at the far edge of the estate. From the windows of his study, I see him looking. I glanced back at the house, towering gray against the autumn sky, and wondered if she was right. Does that bother you? I asked carefully. Lily shook her head, her braids bouncing. No, she said thoughtfully. I think he is lonely. I think he wants to come and play with us, but does not know how. The simplicity of her observation struck me like a blow. She was right, of course. Edward had spent so many years trapped in a loveless marriage, isolated by duty and disappointment, that he had forgotten how to reach out for the things he wanted. Even now, knowing that Lily was his daughter, he seemed paralyzed by uncertainty, unsure of his welcome, afraid perhaps of rejection. That evening, I made a decision. I could not force Edward to claim his daughter openly, could not demand that he acknowledge her before the world. But I could give him the chance to know her, quietly and privately, away from the prying eyes of his family and servants. I found him in the library after Lily had gone to bed, sitting alone before the fire with a glass of brandy in his hand. He looked up as I entered, surprise flickering across his features before he schooled his expression into neutrality. Miss Ashford, he said formally, rising from his chair. I did not expect to see you at this hour. I closed the door behind me and crossed the room to stand before him. Lily has been asking about you, I said without preamble. She wants to know why you watch us from the windows, but never come down to join us. Edward's jaw tightened, and he looked away. It is complicated, he said. There are considerations. She is 6 years old, I interrupted gently. She does not understand considerations. She only knows that there is a kind man with sad eyes who seems to want to know her, and she cannot understand why he keeps his distance. Edward was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "I do not know how to be a father," he said. "I had one son, and I failed him utterly. Thomas grew up spoiled and selfish, caring for nothing but his own pleasure. And I let it happen because I was too consumed with my own unhappiness to pay attention. What if I fail her too?" The vulnerability in his confession made my heart ache. I reached out and took his hand, feeling him stiffen at the contact before slowly relaxing. "You will not fail her," I said quietly, "because you care enough to be afraid of failing. That is more than many fathers can claim." Edward looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same longing I remembered from 7 years ago, the same desperate need for connection that had drawn us together in the first place. "How can you have such faith in me?" he asked. "After everything I have done, everything I failed to do?" "Because I know you," I said simply. "I have always known you, Edward. The man beneath the title, beneath the duty and the expectations. That man is worthy of being loved, and he is more than capable of loving in return." The words hung between us, charged with meaning that went far beyond our conversation about Lily. Edward's hand tightened around mine, and for a moment I thought he might pull me into his arms, might bridge the distance that had separated us for so long. But then he took a breath and stepped back, releasing my hand with obvious reluctance. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I will come down to the gardens tomorrow morning, if you will have me." I smiled, ignoring the disappointment that flickered in my chest. "Lily will be delighted." "And you?" he asked, his gaze searching my face. "Will you be delighted?" I held his gaze for a moment, letting him see the truth in my eyes. "Good night, Your Grace," I said softly, and turned to leave before I could say anything more. The next morning dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect autumn days when the air is crisp and the leaves blaze with color against a sky of deepest blue. I dressed Lily in her best frock, a soft blue cotton that brought out the green in her eyes, and tried to calm my own nervous heart as we made our way to the gardens. Edward was already there when we arrived, standing by the fountain in the center of the rose garden with his hands clasped behind his back. He had abandoned his formal coat for a simpler jacket, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his fingers through it in anxiety. He looked more human than I had seen him since my return, more like the man I remembered from those stolen moments 7 years ago. Lily stopped short when she saw him, her hand tightening around mine. But then she squared her small shoulders and marched forward with a determination that reminded me painfully of her father. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, dropping a curtsy that was only slightly wobbly. "Mama said you might like to walk with us today." Edward knelt down so that he was at her level, his expression softening in a way that made my breath catch. "I would like that very much," he said gravely. "If you would be willing to show me your favorite places in the garden. I confess I have not explored them properly in many years." Lily considered this for a moment, her head tilted to one side. "You should," she said decisively. "There are ever so many interesting things. There is a hedge shaped like a lion, and a pond with goldfish, and a tree that is hollow in the middle where you can hide and no one will ever find you." "That does sound interesting," Edward agreed. "Will you show me?" Lily glanced back at me, seeking permission, and I nodded encouragingly. She turned back to Edward and held out her hand. "Come along then," she said with the casual authority of a child. "We have not got all day." I watched them walk off together, Edward's tall figure bent attentively toward Lily's small one, and felt something shift in my chest. It was too soon to call it hope, too fragile to name, but it was there, a warmth that had been absent from my life for longer than I cared to remember. The morning passed in a blur of discovery and delight. Lily chattered endlessly, pointing out every flower and insect and interesting stone she encountered, and Edward listened with a patience and attention that seemed to surprise even himself. He answered her questions about the history of the house and the names of the plants, and when she declared that she wanted to learn to ride a horse, he promised to teach her himself. I walked a few steps behind them, giving them space to find their own connection while still remaining close enough to observe. It was strange, watching this man I had loved from afar learn to be a father to the daughter he had never known. Strange and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. We had stopped to admire the goldfish pond when the peace of the morning was shattered. "How touching," a voice drawled from behind us, the noble Duke playing nursemaid. What would society say? I turned to find William standing at the edge of the garden, his arms crossed over his chest and a sneer twisting his features. He looked different in the harsh light of day, the charm he wore like a mask stripped away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. Edward straightened, his expression hardening. "What do you want, William?" "Only to observe the happy family gathering," William replied, his gaze sliding to Lily with an interest that made my skin crawl. "She is a pretty little thing, is she not? One might almost think she belongs here." The implication was clear, and I felt my blood run cold. William knew, or had guessed, the truth about Lily, and he was not above using that knowledge as a weapon. Edward stepped forward, placing himself between William and us. "You forget yourself, brother," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is my house, and I will not tolerate your insinuations." William laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the garden walls. "Your house," he repeated mockingly. "Yes, for now. But fortunes change, do they not? Especially when secrets come to light." "If you have something to say," Edward said coldly, "say it plainly." William's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Very well," he said. "I have spent the past few days making inquiries about the child you found among Catherine's things, about its origins and its parentage, and I have discovered some very interesting information. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it." I reached for Lily's hand and drew her close to me, shielding her from whatever was about to happen. "It seems," William continued, his tone almost conversational, "that the baby is not the only Blackwood bastard in this household. In fact, I have it on good authority that your precious governess left this house 7 years ago carrying more than just her belongings." Edward went very still. "What are you implying?" "I am not implying anything," William said. "I am stating a fact. That child," he pointed at Lily, "is your daughter, and you have been harboring her under your roof while pretending to investigate my supposed crimes." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, the whole world holding its breath as the accusation hung in the air. I knew I should speak, should say something to defend myself or deny the charge. But my voice had deserted me, trapped somewhere in my chest, along with my frantically beating heart. I could only stand there, Lily pressed against my side, and wait for the blow to fall. Edward turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw the question he had to ask, even though he already knew the answer. "Clara," he said quietly, "is this true?" I looked at him, at this man who had once held me in his arms and whispered that he loved me, and I could not lie. Not any more. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Lily is your daughter. I have never denied it to you." "But you denied it to the world," William interjected gleefully. "You let everyone believe she was the product of your affair with my nephew Thomas. You let yourself be cast out in disgrace rather than name the real father. How very noble of you." Edward ignored him, his gaze still fixed on my face. "You told me the truth," he said slowly. "That first night, in the nursery, you told me she was mine." "Yes, and I believed you." He took a step toward me, and then another, until he was close enough to touch. "I believed you, Clara, but I needed to hear you say it again, in front of a witness, so that there could be no doubt." I stared at him, confused by his words and his tone. "What do you mean?" Edward turned to face his brother, and there was something triumphant in his expression that I did not understand. "I mean," he said, "that you have just confirmed what I have known for 7 years, that the woman I love is innocent of the charges that were brought against her, and that the man who made those charges," he fixed William with a look of cold fury, did so not out of concern for this family, but out of spite and jealousy and a desire to hurt me in the only way he could. William's face had gone pale. You cannot prove that, can I not? Edward reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. I have here a letter, brother. A letter you wrote to Catherine, congratulating her on the success of your scheme to remove Miss Ashford from this household. You were quite explicit about your reasons. You resented her because I showed her favor. You feared that I might leave my wife for her. And so you invented a scandal, knowing that our mother would believe any accusation against a servant, especially one as beautiful as Clara. That letter proves nothing, William blustered. But I could see the fear in his eyes now, the dawning realization that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. Perhaps not on its own, Edward agreed, but combined with the testimony of the servants who saw you plant evidence in Clara's room, and the footman who watched you bribe a maid to spread rumors about her, I think it will be quite sufficient to convince any court of your guilt. I listened in stunned silence as Edward laid out the case against his brother. He had been investigating, I realized, all those hours closeted in his study, all those meetings with solicitors and strangers. He had been gathering evidence, building a case, preparing to expose the truth that had been hidden for 7 years. You planned this, I breathed, from the moment I arrived. Edward looked at me, and his expression softened. I planned to find the truth, he said, whatever form it took. I had hoped. He paused, gathering himself. I had hoped that you would be vindicated, that I could give you back the reputation that was stolen from you, and that perhaps, in time, you might find it in your heart to forgive me for my cowardice. Forgive you? I did not know whether to laugh or cry. Edward, I never blamed you. I thought I was protecting you by keeping silent, and I thought I was protecting my family by letting you go. He shook his head ruefully. We have both been fools, it seems. William made a sound of disgust. This is all very touching, he said, but you seem to be forgetting something. Even if everything you say is true, even if you can prove that I lied about Clara, there is still the matter of that baby, Catherine's baby. And I assure you, brother, that particular scandal will not be so easily swept under the rug. Edward's expression hardened. No, he agreed. It will not. But then, I never intended to sweep it under the rug. I intend to expose it fully, publicly, so that everyone will know exactly what kind of man you are. You would not dare. William's voice had risen, his composure finally cracking. The scandal would destroy this family. Our name would be ruined. Our name, Edward repeated quietly. You speak of our name as if it were something sacred, something to be protected at all costs. But what good is a name built on lies and betrayal? What honor is there in a family that hides its sins behind a veneer of respectability? He stepped closer to William, and there was something dangerous in his bearing now, the Duke in full command. I have spent my entire life trying to live up to the expectations of this family, he said. I married a woman I did not love because it was expected. I let the woman I did love be cast out in disgrace because it was expected. I turned a blind eye to my wife's coldness and my brother's cruelty because that was what was expected of a gentleman. But no more. What are you going to do? William demanded, but there was fear in his voice now. Real fear. I am going to tell the truth, Edward said simply. All of it. About Catherine's affair, about the baby, about your lies and your schemes. And then, I am going to marry Clara, publicly and proudly, and acknowledge Lily as my daughter and heir. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I heard the words, understood their meaning, but I could not quite make myself believe them. Edward wanted to marry me? After everything that had happened, everything that stood between us, he wanted to make me his wife. You cannot be serious, William sputtered. Society will never accept her. She is a servant, a nobody. She is the mother of my child, Edward replied, his voice ringing with conviction. She is the woman I have loved for 7 years, the woman I should have fought for when I had the chance. and I will not make the same mistake twice." He turned to me, and in his eyes I saw everything I had ever wanted, everything I had told myself I could never have. "Clara," he said softly, "I know this is not how a proposal should be made. I know I am asking you to accept a life that will not be easy, at least at first. But I am asking you nonetheless. Will you marry me?" I looked at him, this proud, flawed, complicated man who had broken my heart and was now offering to mend it. I looked at Lily, who was watching the scene unfold with wide, confused eyes, not understanding what was happening, but sensing its importance. And I looked at William, whose face had gone gray with shock and fury. The choice should have been difficult. There were so many reasons to say no, so many obstacles still standing in our way. But in that moment, standing in the garden where I had once walked as a servant, with the autumn sun warm on my face and my daughter's hand in mine, the answer seemed obvious. "Yes," I said, and felt the words settle into my bones like a homecoming. "Yes, I will marry you." Edward's face transformed, the tension and worry melting away to reveal a joy so pure it took my breath away. He took my hands in his and pressed them to his lips, and I felt the warmth of his kiss through my gloves like a promise. "This is not over," William hissed, backing away from us. "You think you have won, but you have only begun to understand what you have done. When I am finished, you will both regret this day." He turned and stalked away, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I watched him go, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. William was not the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully. Whatever he was planning, I knew it would be dangerous. But for now, in this moment, I refused to let fear overshadow joy. Edward was looking at me as though I were the most precious thing in the world, and Lily was tugging at my sleeve, demanding to know what was happening. I knelt down to her level and took her small hands in mine. "Lily," I said gently, "do you remember how I told you that your father was a good man, who loved us, but could not be with us?" She nodded, her expression solemn. I looked up at Edward, who had knelt down beside me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was not entirely truthful," I continued. "Your father is here, darling. He has been here all along. This is him." Lily looked from me to Edward and back again, processing this information with the careful deliberation of a child. Then she turned to Edward and studied his face intently. "You have the same eyes as me," she said at last. "Mama always said my eyes were special. She said they came from someone very brave and very kind." Edward made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Your mother is too generous," he managed, "but I would very much like the chance to deserve her praise. If you will let me." Lily considered this for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her small hand in his. "I suppose," she said with grave dignity, "that would be acceptable." Edward gathered her into his arms, holding her close, and I watched through tears as father and daughter embraced for the first time. It was not a perfect moment. There was still so much pain in our past, so much uncertainty in our future, but it was a beginning, and that was enough. When Edward finally released Lily, he reached for me, pulling me into the circle of his arms. We stood there together, the three of us, a family at last. And for the first time in 7 years, I allowed myself to believe that everything might actually be all right. The moment was shattered by a scream from the direction of the house. We all spun toward the sound, my heart leaping into my throat. A maid was running across the lawn toward us, her face white with terror, her apron streaming behind her. "Your Grace," she gasped as she reached us. "You must come quickly. It is the baby. Someone has taken the baby." The world narrowed to a single point of terror. Edward was already running toward the house before the maid had finished speaking, his long legs carrying him across the lawn with a speed born of desperation. I scooped Lily into my arms and followed, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The nursery was in chaos when we arrived. Servants clustered in the doorway, their faces pale with shock, while Mrs. Patterson tried to restore order with sharp commands that no one seemed to hear. The cradle stood empty in the center of the room, its blankets thrown aside, the embroidered coverlet with the Blackwood crest lying crumpled on the floor. Edward pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What happened?" he demanded. "Who was watching the child?" A young nursemaid stepped forward, trembling so violently she could barely stand. "I was, Your Grace," she whispered. "I only left for a moment, just to fetch more linens. When I came back, the baby was gone. Did you see anyone? Did you hear anything?" The girl shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Nothing, Your Grace. It was as if the child simply vanished." I set Lily down and knelt beside her, cupping her face in my hands. "I need you to stay here with Mrs. Patterson," I said quietly. "Can you do that for me?" Lily nodded, her eyes wide and frightened. "What is happening, Mama?" "Someone has taken the baby," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. "We need to find him. Will you be brave for me?" She squared her small shoulders, that familiar determination settling over her features. "I will be brave," she promised. I kissed her forehead and rose to find Edward already issuing orders. He was organizing search parties, sending men to check the grounds and the outbuildings, dispatching riders to watch the roads leading away from the estate. His voice was steady, commanding, but I could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the fear he was fighting to keep hidden. I crossed to his side and touched his arm. "William," I said quietly. "It has to be William." Edward nodded grimly. "I know. I have already sent men to find him. He was seen leaving the house shortly before the alarm was raised. Where would he take the child? I do not know." Edward's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "But I intend to find out." The dowager appeared in the doorway, her face ashen beneath its careful composure. She looked from the empty cradle to Edward and then to me, and something flickered in her expression that I could not quite read. "I warned you," she said quietly. "I told you there were forces at work here that you did not understand." Edward turned on her, his patience finally snapping. "If you know something, Mother, now would be the time to share it." The dowager was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. Then she seemed to come to some decision, her spine straightening with the resolve of a woman who had spent a lifetime navigating treacherous waters. "Follow me," she said. "Both of you. There are things you need to know." She led us to her private sitting room, a space I had never been permitted to enter during my time as governess. It was smaller than I had expected, furnished with the accumulated treasures of a lifetime, portraits and miniatures covering every surface. The dowager closed the door behind us and gestured for us to sit, but I was too anxious to settle, and Edward remained standing as well. "What I am about to tell you," the dowager began, "must never leave this room. The reputation of this family depends upon it." "I believe we are past the point of protecting reputations," Edward said coldly. "A child has been taken. Whatever secrets you have been keeping, they are not worth an innocent life." The dowager flinched as if he had struck her, but she did not look away. "You are right, of course," she said softly. "I have been a fool, protecting lies while the truth festered beneath the surface. But you must understand, Edward, I did what I thought was best. I always did what I thought was best." She moved to a small writing desk in the corner and withdrew a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, tied together with a faded ribbon. "These are letters," she said, "from your father to a woman named Eleanor Marsh. They span nearly 20 years, from before his marriage to me until shortly before his death." Edward's face had gone very still. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that your father had a mistress," the dowager replied, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered in her eyes. "A woman he loved far more than he ever loved me. And I am saying that William is not your brother, Edward. He is your half-brother, the son of Eleanor Marsh and your father's betrayal." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Edward struggle to process this revelation, watched the emotions chase each other across his face. Shock, disbelief, and then a terrible understanding that seemed to age him before my eyes. "William knows," he said at last. "That is why he has always hated me. Because I am legitimate and he is not. The Dowager nodded. He discovered the truth when he was 16. He found the letters, just as I had found them years before. I tried to explain, tried to make him understand that he was still part of this family, that I had raised him as my own, despite everything. But he could not forgive. He blamed me for his mother's death, blamed you for existing, blamed the entire world for the circumstances of his birth. His mother, I repeated, my mind racing. What happened to her? She died in childbirth, the Dowager said quietly, bringing William into the world. My husband brought the baby home and told the servants that I had given birth in secret, that the child was mine. I was expected to raise my husband's bastard as my own son, to love him and care for him and never speak a word of the truth. And you did, Edward said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. You raised him. You gave him everything a legitimate son would have had. The Dowager's composure cracked just for a moment. I tried, she whispered. God knows I tried. But he was never mine, not really. He had his mother's eyes, her smile, and every time I looked at him, I saw the woman who had stolen my husband's heart. I am not proud of it, but I could never love him the way I loved you, Edward. And he knew. He always knew. I thought of William, of the bitterness that lurked behind his charming smile, the resentment that colored every interaction with his brother. It did not excuse what he had done, the lies he had told, and the lives he had ruined, but it explained them, at least in part. He was a man who had grown up knowing he was unwanted, unloved, a shameful secret hidden behind a veneer of respectability. No wonder he had learned to hate. Where would he take the baby? I asked, bringing us back to the urgent matter at hand. If he knows the child is his, if he has been planning this. The Dowager shook her head. I do not know. But there is a cottage, on the far edge of the estate. It belonged to Eleanor years ago. William used to go there sometimes when he was younger. I always assumed he went to feel closer to his mother. Edward was already moving toward the door. I will find him, he said grimly. Stay here. Keep Lily safe. I caught his arm before he could leave. I am coming with you. Clara, no, it is too dangerous. I met his gaze without flinching. That child is innocent, I said, and William has already threatened me once. I will not hide while others risk themselves on my behalf. Edward looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him. He nodded once, sharply, and we left the Dowager's sitting room together. The ride to the cottage seemed to take forever. We pushed the horses hard, racing through the autumn woods as the afternoon light began to fade. I had not ridden in years, not since my days as governess when I had sometimes accompanied the children on their lessons, but the skill came back quickly, my body remembering what my mind had forgotten. The cottage appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, small and weathered, with ivy climbing its walls and smoke rising from its chimney. Someone was there. Someone had lit a fire and was waiting. Edward dismounted and helped me down, his hands lingering on my waist for just a moment. Stay behind me, he said quietly. Whatever happens, stay behind me. We approached the cottage slowly, every sense alert for danger. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see the flicker of firelight and hear the thin, reedy cry of a baby. Edward pushed the door open and stepped inside, and I followed close on his heels. William was sitting by the fire, the baby cradled in his arms. He looked up as we entered, and there was something in his expression that I had never seen before. Not anger, not bitterness, but a profound and terrible grief. I wondered how long it would take you to find me, he said quietly. I suppose Mother told you about the cottage. She told us everything, Edward replied, his voice carefully neutral. About Eleanor, about your birth, about the lies that have shaped this family for 30 years. William laughed, a hollow sound that held no humor. The lies, he repeated. Yes, there have been so many lies, so many secrets and deceptions and convenient fictions. I have spent my entire life drowning in them. He looked down at the baby in his arms, and his expression softened. "But this child is not a lie," he said. "This child is the only true thing I have ever created, the only part of me that is not tainted by the circumstances of my birth." "William," I said carefully, stepping forward, "the baby needs to come home. Whatever grievances you have with this family, the child is innocent." Innocent? William's gaze lifted to mine, and I saw the madness lurking behind his eyes. Yes, he is innocent. Just as I was innocent once, before I learned what I was, before I understood that I would never be good enough, never be loved enough, never be anything more than a shameful secret to be hidden away. "That is not true," Edward said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "I never knew the truth about your birth. I never treated you as anything less than my brother." "No," William agreed. "You treated me with kindness and respect, and that was somehow worse. Because I knew what you did not. I knew that if you ever learned the truth, that kindness would turn to disgust, that respect would become contempt. I could not bear to watch it happen, so I struck first. I hurt you before you could hurt me." "By destroying Clara," Edward said quietly. "By framing an innocent woman for a sin she did not commit." William's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do. She was a threat. You were falling in love with her. Anyone could see it. And if you had left Catherine for a governess, the scandal would have destroyed everything. Mother would have disowned you. The title would have passed to me. And then everyone would have known the truth. Everyone would have seen that the new Duke was nothing but a bastard playing at nobility." The twisted logic of his reasoning made my head spin. He had destroyed my life, torn apart my reputation and my future, not out of malice but out of fear. Fear that his own secrets would be exposed. Fear that he would lose the precarious position he had carved out for himself in a family that had never truly accepted him. "And Catherine," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, "did you love her, or was she just another piece in your game?" William's expression flickered, with something that might have been genuine emotion. "I loved her," he said quietly, "as much as I am capable of loving anyone. She was the only person who ever looked at me and saw something worth wanting. She did not care about my birth or my legitimacy. She only cared that I made her feel alive." "She was my wife," Edward said, and there was ice in his voice. "She was never yours," William shot back. "Not in any way that mattered. You married her because it was expected. You shared her bed because duty demanded it. But you never loved her, Edward. You never even tried." The accusation hung in the air, painful because it was true. Edward had not loved Catherine. He had done his duty by her, had been faithful in body if not in heart, but he had never given her the devotion she craved. And in the absence of that love, she had turned to William, seeking in the bastard brother what the legitimate one could not provide. "None of this excuses what you have done," Edward said at last. "The lies, the betrayals, the child you have stolen from his cradle. Whatever wrongs have been done to you, they do not justify this." William looked down at the baby again, and I saw his arms tighten around the small form. "He is my son," he said. "The only family I have ever truly had. I will not let you take him from me." "No one wants to take him from you," I said, stepping closer despite the warning look Edward gave me. "But a child needs more than one person to love him. He needs a home, a family, people who will care for him and protect him. You cannot give him that if you are running, hiding, living as a fugitive." "What would you have me do?" William demanded, and there was desperation in his voice now. "Surrender. Go back to that house and face my mother's contempt, my brother's judgment. Watch my son grow up knowing that his father is a liar and a thief and a bastard." I knelt down beside him, close enough to touch, close enough to see the tears that he was struggling to hold back. "I would have you start again," I said gently. "I would have you be the father this child deserves, not the bitter, broken man you have become." "It is not too late, William. It is never too late to choose a different path." William stared at me, and I saw the war raging behind his eyes. The pride and the pain, the fear and the desperate longing for something better. He was not a monster, I realized. He was a wounded animal, lashing out at the world because he had never learned any other way to survive. "You should hate me," he whispered, "after everything I did to you. You should want me to suffer." I shook my head slowly. "Hate is a heavy burden to carry," I said. "I have spent 7 years learning to put it down. I would not wish that weight on anyone, not even you." The silence stretched between us, thick with possibility. And then, slowly, William's arms relaxed. He looked down at the baby, pressed a kiss to the small forehead, and then held the child out toward me. "Take him," he said, his voice breaking. "Take him and keep him safe. I cannot. I do not know how to be what he needs. But perhaps you do." I took the baby carefully, cradling him against my chest. He was warm and soft, his eyes already drifting closed, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded around him. I looked at William and saw a man defeated, broken, stripped of everything he had used to armor himself against the world. "What happens now?" he asked, looking up at Edward with hollow eyes. Edward was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he crossed to where his brother sat and extended his hand. "Now," he said quietly, "we go home. All of us. And we find a way forward that does not involve lies or secrets or pain." William stared at the offered hand, as if he did not understand what it meant. "And when we get there," he asked, "what then? Do you hand me over to the authorities? Do you have me shipped off to the colonies like an embarrassment to be hidden?" Edward shook his head. "You are my brother," he said simply. "Whatever the circumstances of your birth, whatever sins you have committed, that has not changed. I am not offering you absolution, William. What you did to Clara, to this family, cannot be undone with a handshake. But I am offering you the chance to make amends, to be the man you might have been, if the world had been kinder." William's hand trembled as he reached out to take Edward's. "I do not deserve this," he said. "No," Edward agreed. "But perhaps that is exactly why it matters." He pulled William to his feet, and for a moment the two brothers stood face to face, all the years of resentment and misunderstanding hanging between them. Then William's shoulders slumped, the fight going out of him at last, and he nodded. The ride back to Blackwood Manor was quiet. William rode ahead with Edward, the two of them speaking in low voices that I could not hear. I followed behind, the baby sleeping peacefully in my arms, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. It was not the ending I had expected. I had prepared myself for violence, for confrontation, for the kind of dramatic climax that belonged in a penny novel. Instead, there had been only words, only pain and grief, and the slow, difficult work of understanding. The Dowager was waiting for us when we arrived, her face a mask of anxious composure. When she saw William, something in her expression cracked, revealing the woman beneath the armor. "You came back," she said, and there were tears in her voice. William dismounted and stood before her, his head bowed. "I came back," he agreed, "though I do not know if you want me here." The Dowager reached out and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I have made many mistakes," she said quietly. "I have been cold when I should have been warm, distant when I should have been close. But I never wanted you gone, William. I only wanted you to be happy." I watched as mother and son embraced, awkwardly at first, and then with growing desperation. It was not forgiveness, not yet. There was too much history between them, too many wounds that needed time to heal. But it was a beginning, the first tentative step towards something better. Edward came to stand beside me, his hand finding mine. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. I looked up at him, at this man who had surprised me at every turn, who had shown himself capable of a mercy I had not expected. "I am tired," I admitted, "and confused, and not entirely certain what happens next." Edward smiled, a weary but genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. What happens next, he said, is that we put this child to bed, and then we put ourselves to bed. And tomorrow, we begin the long, difficult work of building a family out of the wreckage of the one we had. It was not a fairy tale ending. There were no triumphant declarations, no villains vanquished and heroes rewarded. There was only the quiet truth of people trying to do better, to be better, to find some way through the darkness into the light. But as I walked into Blackwood Manor with the baby in my arms and Edward's hand in mine, I thought that perhaps this was better than any fairy tale, because it was real, because it was ours, because it was just the beginning of something new. Lily was waiting in the entrance hall, her small face anxious until she saw us. She ran to me and threw her arms around my waist, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "You found him," she said. "You brought him home." "We did," I agreed, kneeling down to her level. "We brought him home." Lily looked at the baby with curious eyes. "What is his name?" she asked. I looked at Edward, and he looked at William, who stood apart from us, uncertain of his welcome. "He does not have one yet," I said. "Perhaps you could help us choose." Lily considered this with the gravity of a child entrusted with an important task. "I think," she said slowly, "that he should be called Hope. Because that is what he is, a new hope for everyone." I felt tears prick at my eyes, and I saw that I was not the only one. Edward cleared his throat roughly, and even William looked away, blinking rapidly. "Hope," Edward repeated softly. "Yes, I think that suits him perfectly." And so the baby was named, there in the entrance hall of Blackwood Manor, by a 6-year-old girl who understood better than any of us what this family needed most. Not revenge, not justice, not the settling of old scores, just hope. Simple, stubborn, persistent hope that tomorrow could be better than today. We would need a great deal of that hope in the days to come. There would be explanations and recriminations, scandals to weather and wounds to heal. The world would not accept our unconventional family easily, and there would be those who sought to tear us apart. But that night, as I tucked Lily into bed and kissed her forehead, as I placed baby Hope in his cradle and watched him sleep, as I stood at the window of my room and looked out at the moonlit gardens of the estate that had once been my prison and would soon be my home, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in 7 long years. I felt at peace. Edward found me there, standing in the silver light, and he did not speak. He simply came to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, his warmth a comfort in the cool night air. We stood together in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, and I knew that whatever challenges awaited us, we would face them together. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The weeks that followed were not easy. I had never expected them to be. Scandal does not simply evaporate because the people at its center have made their peace with one another, and the whispers that swirled through society were relentless and cruel. The Duke of Ashworth was marrying his former governess. The Duchess had died carrying another man's child. The brother was a bastard, the family a den of secrets and lies. The gossips feasted on every morsel, and there were days when I wondered if we would ever emerge from the shadow of their judgment. But Edward was steadfast. He had made his decision, and he would not be moved from it. He announced our engagement in the Times, a simple notice that stated the facts without apology or explanation. He took me to church on his arm, in full view of the neighbors who had once seen me scrubbing floors and minding children. He introduced Lily as his daughter, formally and publicly, and dared anyone to question her legitimacy. Some did, of course. There were doors that closed to us, invitations that never came, old friends who suddenly found themselves too busy to call. Edward bore it all with a dignity that humbled me, never once showing the hurt I knew he must feel at the rejection of the world he had been raised to inhabit. "I am not losing anything that matters," he told me one evening, when I tried to apologize for the 100th time. "I am gaining everything that does." The wedding was held on a crisp December morning in the small chapel on the Blackwood estate. It was not the grand society affair that a duke's wedding should have been. There were no hundreds of guests, No elaborate feast, no weeks of celebration. There was only family, such as it was, gathered together in the candlelit space to witness the union that should have happened 7 years before. The dowager sat in the front pew, her face carefully composed, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. She had not fully forgiven me, I knew, for disrupting the careful order of her world, but she had accepted me in her own guarded way, and that was more than I had ever expected. William stood beside Edward as his witness, a position that had caused no small amount of controversy when it was announced, but Edward had been insistent. "My brother has made mistakes," he said, "terrible mistakes. But he is trying to make amends, and I will not cast him out when he is fighting so hard to find his way back." And William was trying. I could see it in the way he devoted himself to baby Hope, spending hours in the nursery, learning to feed and comfort and care for the child he had nearly lost. I could see it in the way he approached Edward, tentative and humble, seeking advice on matters of the estate and listening carefully to the answers. I could see it in the way he looked at the dowager, no longer with resentment, but with a cautious, fragile hope that perhaps, after all these years, they might find some kind of peace. He was not forgiven. The wounds he had inflicted were too deep for easy absolution, and there were nights when I still woke from dreams of that terrible time, the humiliation and fear fresh as if no years had passed. But I had meant what I said in the cottage. Hate was too heavy a burden to carry. And watching William struggle to become a better man, I found that my anger slowly transformed into something else. Not affection, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Lily walked before me down the aisle, scattering rose petals from a basket clutched in her small hands. She had insisted on being part of the ceremony, had spent weeks helping me choose my dress and plan the flowers and decide on every detail. This was her family being made official, her father finally taking his rightful place, and she approached the responsibility with the gravity it deserved. Edward waited at the altar, and when I saw his face as I walked toward him, I felt every doubt and fear fall away. He looked at me as though I were the most precious thing in the world, as though every step I took brought him closer to a joy he had never dared to imagine. I had seen many expressions on his face over the years: the cool mask of the Duke, the raw vulnerability of the man who had confessed his failures, the fierce protectiveness of a father discovering his child. But this was something new. This was hope without reservation, love without fear, a heart finally allowed to feel everything it had been denied. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. We spoke the words that would bind us together, exchanged the rings that would mark us as husband and wife. And when Edward kissed me, there in the chapel, where generations of Blackwoods had been married and buried and christened, I felt the last of my old life slip away, replaced by something new and strange and wonderful. We were a family now, a proper family, with all the complications and challenges that entailed. But we were together, and that was what mattered. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. I had to learn how to be a duchess, a role for which my years as a governess had not prepared me. There were servants to manage and accounts to oversee, social obligations to navigate, and traditions to uphold. The great house that had once been my workplace became my home, and I walked its corridors not as a servant, but as its mistress. It was strange at first. The same rooms where I had once emptied chamber pots and polished silver now belonged to me. The servants who had been my colleagues now curtsied and called me Your Grace. I found myself apologizing constantly, thanking people for tasks they were paid to perform, struggling to adopt the easy authority that came naturally to those born to privilege. Edward was patient with me, gently correcting my missteps without ever making me feel foolish. You do not need to be someone you are not, he told me one evening when I confessed my fears of inadequacy. The staff respects you because you are kind and fair and because you understand their lives in a way that most mistresses never will. That is worth more than all the aristocratic polish in the world. Lily flourished in her new circumstances. She had a governess of her own now, a young woman named Miss Pemberton who reminded me painfully of my younger self. She had a pony and a wardrobe full of pretty dresses and a bedroom that was larger than the cottage where we had spent the first years of her life. But she remained the same child she had always been, curious and compassionate, with a wisdom that belied her years. She adored Edward, and he adored her in return. I would find them together in the library, heads bent over a book of fairy tales. I would hear them laughing in the stables where he was teaching her to ride. I would watch them walk hand in hand through the gardens, Edward pointing out the names of plants and birds, while Lily peppered him with endless questions. "He is making up for lost time," the dowager observed one afternoon, watching them from the window of the morning room. "I have never seen him so happy." I joined her at the window, studying the two figures on the lawn below. Lily was trying to catch butterflies while Edward looked on, his face soft with affection. "He has much to make up for," I said quietly. "We both do." The dowager was silent for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she reached out and took my hand. "I was wrong about you," she said, the words clearly costing her something. "I thought you were a schemer, a fortune hunter, a woman who would bring nothing but scandal to this family. But I see now that I was mistaken. You have brought my son something I never could. You have brought him joy." I squeezed her hand, surprised by the gesture and touched by the admission. "Thank you, Your Grace." She made a dismissive sound, but I saw the faint flush of color on her cheeks. "Do not thank me yet," she said briskly. "There is still the matter of society to contend with. The spring season will be upon us before we know it, and there will be battles to fight." She was right, of course. As the winter melted into spring and the social calendar began to fill, we faced the challenge of reintroducing ourselves to a world that had already judged and condemned us. There would be balls and dinners and garden parties, each one a test of our resolve, each one an opportunity for our enemies to strike. But we were not without allies. Old friends of Edward's, men who valued substance over scandal, began to call. Their wives, curious at first and then genuinely welcoming, took me under their wings and helped me navigate the treacherous waters of high society. And slowly, grudgingly, the doors that had been closed to us began to open once more. The turning point came at the Duchess of Richmond's spring ball, one of the most prestigious events of the season. We had not been invited, of course. The Duchess was a notorious stickler for propriety, and our presence would have caused too much comment for her comfort. But Edward had called in old favors and pressed old connections, and somehow, at the last moment, an invitation had appeared. I dressed with care that evening, choosing a gown of deep blue silk that Edward had commissioned for me from the finest modiste in London. It was elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful without being showy, the perfect armor for the battle we were about to face. Edward took my hand as we stepped out of the carriage, his grip warm and reassuring. "Whatever happens tonight," he murmured, "remember that you are my wife, the Duchess of Ashworth, and you have more right to be here than any of them." I smiled up at him, drawing strength from his confidence. "Let us show them what we are made of." The ballroom fell silent as we entered, hundreds of eyes turning to stare at the scandal of the season made flesh. I felt the weight of their judgment, the whispered comments and pointed looks, the fans raised to hide smirking lips. But I kept my head high and my hand steady on Edward's arm, and I walked through that gauntlet of disapproval as though I were born to it. The first person to approach us was Lady Hartwell, a formidable matron whose approval could make or break a reputation. She looked at me for a long moment, her sharp eyes taking my measure, and then she smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine, that transformed her severe features into something almost kind. "Lady Ashworth," she said, extending her hand, "I have heard a great deal about you. I am pleased to finally make your acquaintance." It was a seal of approval, a blessing from one of society's most powerful gatekeepers, and with that simple gesture, the tide began to turn. Others followed Lady Hartwell's lead, approaching to offer congratulations and welcomes, to compliment my gown, and inquire about Lily. By the end of the evening, I had danced twice with the Prince of Wales and received invitations to half a dozen of the season's most exclusive events. We had arrived. Against all odds, against all expectations, we had been accepted. The carriage ride home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Edward held my hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm, and I leaned against his shoulder, exhausted but triumphant. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "I have never been more proud." I turned to look at him, at this man who had become my husband, my partner, the love of my life. "I could not have done it without you," I said, "without your faith in me." Edward shook his head. "You had that strength all along," he said. "I merely gave you the opportunity to show it." We arrived home to find Lily waiting up for us, unable to sleep until she heard every detail of the ball. I sat on the edge of her bed and described the dresses and the dancing, the music and the magnificent decorations, while she listened with shining eyes and endless questions. "Were you the most beautiful lady there?" she asked. "I am certain you were." I laughed and kissed her forehead. "I do not know about that," I said, "but I do know that I was the happiest, because I had your father beside me, and I knew that you were waiting at home." Lily smiled and snuggled deeper into her pillows. "I am glad," she murmured, her eyes already drifting closed. "I am glad we are a family now. So am I, my darling. So am I." Summer came, and with it, the lazy golden days that I had always loved best. We spent long afternoons in the gardens, picnicking by the lake, exploring the far corners of the estate that I had never been permitted to visit as a servant. Edward taught Lily to fish, and I taught her to press flowers, and we all learned together how to be a family. Baby Hope grew fat and happy under our care, his red hair darkening to auburn, his blue eyes curious and bright. William visited often, sometimes staying for weeks at a time, and I watched him transform from the bitter, broken man I had confronted in the cottage into something softer, something healed. He would never be entirely free of the shadows that haunted him. The circumstances of his birth, the love he had been denied, the choices he had made in his pain and anger. But he was learning to live with those shadows, to acknowledge them without letting them define him. And in Hope, his son, he found a reason to keep trying. "I forgive you," I told him one evening, as we sat together on the terrace watching the sun set over the gardens. It was not an easy thing to say. The wounds he had inflicted still ached sometimes, in the quiet moments when memories surfaced unbidden. But I had come to understand that forgiveness was not about pretending the hurt had never happened. It was about choosing to move forward anyway. William looked at me, his pale eyes bright with surprise, and something that might have been gratitude. "I do not deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly. "Perhaps not," I agreed, "but I am giving it nonetheless, not for your sake, William, but for mine, and for the sake of this family we are trying to build." He was silent for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "I will try to be worthy of it." It was not a resolution, not a neat tying up of loose ends. But it was enough. It was more than enough. Autumn came again, painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson, and with it came the anniversary of my return to Blackwood Manor. 1 year since I had stepped through those iron gates, my heart pounding with fear and anger and a desperate secret hope. 1 year since I had faced the ghosts of my past and discovered that they held less power than I had imagined. Edward found me standing by the window of our bedroom, looking out at the grounds that had become so familiar, so dear. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder, and for a long moment we simply stood together, watching the leaves fall. "A year," he murmured. "It seems both longer and shorter than that." I nodded, leaning back into his embrace. "So much has changed. Are you happy?" The question was quiet, almost hesitant, and I heard the vulnerability beneath it. Edward still doubted sometimes, still wondered if he had given me enough, been enough, to make up for all the years of separation. I turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his face in my hands. "I am happier than I ever imagined I could be," I said firmly. "I have you, I have Lily. I have a home and a family and a future full of possibility. What more could I ask for?" Edward smiled, and I saw the relief in his eyes, the joy that he still sometimes struggled to accept. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing at all." He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I melted into his arms as I had done 1,000 times before and would do 1,000 times again. This was my life now. This man, this place, this improbable, impossible happiness that had grown from the ashes of my old despair. That evening, we gathered in the drawing room for a quiet family celebration. The Dowager was there, her sharp edges softened by the passage of time and the unexpected joy of grandchildren. William was there, with hope in his arms, the baby babbling happily at the candlelight. Miss Pemberton had been given the evening off, so Lily sat with us, full of questions and observations and the boundless energy of childhood. We ate and drank and talked, sharing stories and laughter and the comfortable silences of people who have learned to be at ease with one another. And when the evening grew late and Lily began to yawn, Edward rose and lifted her into his arms. "Time for bed, little one," he said. Lily wrapped her arms around his neck and rested her head on his shoulder. "Will you tell me a story, Papa?" The word still made my heart swell every time I heard it. Papa. The title Edward had earned through patience and love and the daily work of building a relationship with the daughter he had missed for so long. "Of course," he said. "What kind of story would you like?" Lily considered this with the gravity it deserved. A story about a princess, she decided. A princess who was lost and then found. A princess who lived happily ever after. Edward met my eyes over her head, and I saw the tears he was trying to blink away. "I know just the one," he said softly. "It is the story of your mother." He carried her out of the room, their voices fading as they climbed the stairs, and I was left alone with the Dowager and William and the quiet contentment of a perfect evening. The Dowager rose and came to sit beside me on the settee. She took my hand in hers, a gesture that had become familiar in recent months, a bridge between two women who had once been enemies. "You have saved this family," she said quietly. "I want you to know that I understand it now, even if I was too blind to see it before. You are the best thing that ever happened to my son." I squeezed her hand, moved beyond words. "Thank you," I managed. She nodded briskly, her composure restored. "Now then, we must discuss the Christmas preparations. I have ideas about the menu, and I want your opinion on the decorations." And just like that, we were back to normal. The Dowager, imperious and demanding, and me, trying to keep up with her endless plans and schemes. But there was warmth beneath the formality now, affection beneath the duty. We had found our way to each other, against all odds. William excused himself shortly after, carrying Hope up to the nursery with a tenderness that still surprised me. I watched him go, this man who had caused me so much pain, and felt only a quiet peace. We are all capable of change, I thought. We are all capable of becoming better than we were. When Edward returned, he found me alone in the drawing room, staring into the fire with a cup of tea cooling in my hands. He settled beside me on the settee, his arm around my shoulders, and for a long while we simply sat together in the warmth and silence. "What are you thinking about?" he asked at last. I smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I am thinking about how strange life is, how the things that seem like endings are so often beginnings, how the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best." Edward pressed a kiss to my temple. "I think about that too," he admitted. "If I had been braver 7 years ago, if I had fought for you the way I should have, we might have been spared so much pain. Or we might have been destroyed by the scandal," I countered gently. "We might have lost everything, including each other. Perhaps things happened the way they needed to happen. Perhaps we were not ready then to be what we are now." Edward considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. "You may be right," he said at last. We have both changed, grown, become stronger. Perhaps we needed those years apart to become the people we are today. I turned to face him, taking his hands in mine. No more regrets, I said firmly. No more looking back and wishing things had been different. We have each other now. We have Lily, and Hope, and this family we have built. That is what matters. That is everything. Edward's eyes searched my face, and then he smiled, a real smile that lit up his features and made him look years younger. No more regrets, he agreed. Only the future. He kissed me then, and I let myself sink into the warmth and safety of his arms. Outside, the wind was rising, scattering the last leaves of autumn and heralding the approach of winter. But inside, by the fire, in the home that had once been my prison and was now my sanctuary, I felt only peace. I had come to Blackwood Manor 7 years ago as a servant, full of dreams and hopes that had been cruelly shattered. I had returned a year ago as a ghost, summoned to face the wreckage of my past. And now I was staying as its mistress, the Duchess of Ashworth, wife and mother and keeper of this complicated, imperfect, beautiful family. It was more than I had ever dared to imagine. It was everything I had ever wanted. And as I sat there in my husband's arms, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of the fire within, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever trials the future might bring, we would face them together. A family forged in pain and redeemed by love. A story that had seemed destined for tragedy, but had found its way at last to joy. This was my happy ending. Not a fairy tale, not a dream, but something real and earned and infinitely precious. And it was only the beginning.